Yes, that scream was deafening, but this was not the worst. The boy in the video screamed not just for a moment, but for the entire duration of this 8-hour plane ride. Even though that's unbearable, there are moments even worse in this video because today we're going to show you some of the most unbelievable airplane moments of all time. So, stay tuned here at Wise Fool. Let's start with a terrifying experience that happened to the passengers of a plane heading to Korea. Just before landing, one of the passengers decided out of nowhere to open the aircraft door. The incoming air current was so strong that some passengers had to fear being pulled out. The extreme suction also made it impossible for the crew to close the door again, which is why it had to remain open until the plane was loaded. After the aircraft landed successfully, despite the difficult circumstances, 12 of the passengers even had to be driven directly to the hospital due to hyperventilation. The police were already waiting for the culprit, who was arrested on the runway. The reason for his suicidal action is still not known. Let's continue with a violent landing, which must have shocked the drivers on this highway. In the middle of the night, in the US state of Minnesota, a single-engine plane had to make an emergency landing. The plane collided with a car, but miraculously, none of the people involved were injured. The plane had previously suffered engine failure. Next, we come to one of the strangest airplane moments of all time, which happened just this year. A few months ago, American Phil Stringer wanted to visit his family and booked a 2-hour flight from Oklahoma to Charlotte. But then something happened that was nothing special at first. His flight was delayed. In the end, Stringer sat at the airport for an incredible 18 hours, waiting for his plane. When Stringer finally heard the redeeming call for his flight, he went to his gate and could hardly believe his eyes. He was the only passenger boarding the plane. Once on board, he was given a security demonstration just for him, and the crew took great care of their only guest. He was given all kinds of drinks and snacks, and even made friends with the flight attendants, who had never experienced such a flight before. According to his own statements, he is still in contact with the flight attendants today. Let's continue. Perhaps some of you still remember the horror comedy Snakes on a Plane, in which countless poisonous snakes in an airplane caused fear and terror. But the scenario is not so absurd and far from reality. In fact, a passenger was stung by a real scorpion during a flight from Los Angeles. The plane had to turn around to get the young woman to a hospital as soon as possible, because that was the only way she could survive the unusual and quite dangerous incident. How exactly the scorpion got on board in the first place is still unclear. Since scorpions are venomous, the woman only had a few hours before she could have died from the sting. Let's move to this highly dramatic footage taken at Kabul Airport in 2021. At that time, in fact, the US military was moving out of Afghanistan from a 20-year stay. This was a major blow to the Afghan people, as it gave the Taliban the opportunity to take power in Afghanistan again. Therefore, the people in this video are trying to stop the plane from leaving without them. Some of them even attached themselves to the plane that was already flying, risking their lives. Unfortunately, after that, it came as it was expected, and since August 2021, the Taliban has controlled Afghanistan again. Let's move on to another true incident from the year 2022, in which a beautiful flight to the Bahamas turned out to be an absolute horror scenario. Because in the middle of the flight, the pilot of a small Cessna lost consciousness and could not be woken up. Darren Harrison was the only passenger sitting alone in the sinking plane. Without flying experience, he contacted an airport tower where Robert Morgan was working. Morgan, in addition to being an air traffic controller, happened to be a flight instructor with over 20 years of experience. So, he began to talk with Harrison and helped him operate the machine.
Try to hold the wings level and see if you can start descending for me.
Even though Harrison had no idea where exactly he was, Morgan located him and navigated for him, allowing Harrison to land the plane safely at an American airport. This is a real feat for a novice pilot without an hour of flying experience. Most importantly, Morgan's experience as a flight instructor made this miracle possible. Passengers on a domestic flight in the USA experienced a heartwarming moment. Shortly after the plane took off, the pilot suddenly said,
"Tonight is a special night for us, especially for one person on board this flight. The person who stole my heart since the first day we met."
public declaration of love through the announcement microphone was meant for his girlfriend, who didn't even know that her boyfriend was flying the plane that day. It was even more surprising for her that she received a proposal from him at an altitude of 10,000 feet. Let's move on from romantic flight experiences to extremely life-threatening situations on board. Because when Flight 5390 took off from Birmingham to Malaga on June 10, 1990, no one suspected that this trip would go down in history. Shortly after pilot Tim Lancaster unbuckled his seatbelt, there was a sudden loud bang, and the cockpit window flew off without warning. Before Lancaster realized what had just happened, the pilot was already pulled out through the hole. By chance, however, his leg got caught in the controls, holding him in place for the time being. When a flight attendant heard the bang, he and 2 other employees were immediately on the scene and tried to pull Lancaster back into the aircraft. However, it was in vain, because the pilot was pressed against the plane so strongly by the extreme speed that it was impossible to get him back into the cockpit. Parallel to the rescue attempts, the young co-pilot Alistair Acheson did everything he could to get the crashing plane back under control. That's because the incoming air caused a massive depressurization that sent the plane hurtling toward the ground at an enormous speed. To make matters worse, Acheson could only use the right section of the controls, as Lancaster's legs blocked the left half. In the back of the plane, the 87 passengers became extremely panicked, and the flight attendants prepared the guests for the worst. But then, the unbelievable happened. Acheson, against all odds, managed to get the plane to descend. Meanwhile, the 3 flight attendants were still holding Lancaster tightly by his legs, even though his now cold body was hanging motionless from the plane. When Acheson finally landed the plane, several rescue workers were already waiting on the ground. When they were able to rescue Lancaster, however, they were surprised to find that, apart from a few slight fractures and bruises and some signs of frostbite, he had suffered no major damage and was only unconscious. The crew members of the airline Turkish Airlines also showed total commitment. Something unexpected happened there. A 6-month pregnant passenger suddenly went into labor, and a premature birth was imminent. Without any medical expertise, they helped the Turkish woman to give birth to her first son at an altitude of several thousand feet and in good health. From beautiful events on board, we now come to a highly tragic flight moment. This video from July 29, 2023, shows the last shots of the Brazilian Garan Maia and his son. The shocking thing is that the father is drinking a beer with pleasure and lets his son, who is just 11 years old, steer the plane. Shortly after the footage was taken, the plane crashed, with none of those present surviving. However, not every crash has to end fatally. For example, the footage from a GoPro shows a small plane crash that had to make an emergency landing in the middle of the ocean between 2 Hawaiian islands. All passengers remained extremely calm and were able to escape from the sinking plane. With life jackets on, they waited for help, which arrived within minutes. That was our video on some of the most unbelievable airplane moments of all time. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you next time here at Wise Fool.